Well, folks, welcome back for another episode of What's Next, the podcast for all of us athletes turned entrepreneur, maybe trying to figure out if we should. I'm going to be honest with you. This episode might be a lot more for me than it is for you because I kind of get a kindred spirit here in the love of soccer. Entrepreneur, exceed at a top level on both the field, and then you're going to hear about business and some of those things. But it's kind of cool to have some comrades in arms here, and we got to catch up over the phone a little bit ago. And quite frankly, we don't have 15 years of history, so it's kind of cool that I get to ask these questions that I just want to ask. We were sitting around having a beer. So, Jason Okroy, welcome to the show, and we're so excited to have you.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate you having me today.
So I'm going to kick this off. Like, we're going to dive right in here. The old adage, I think, in business, and I'll say old, but it seems like it's been this recurring theme on the show, which is do what you love. And when you do that, you won't say you never work a day in your life, because we all know that not to be true. But honestly, it's pretty damn fun. So you play soccer at Western, all the accolades there. You get out. I think most people would say, great, you love soccer. Why don't you just go be a soccer coach? Then you're doing what you love. Mm-hmm. You went on to start, among other things in life, but a business, Salute Mission Critical, to manage, honestly, like the world's best data centers with over 1,000 employees, win all these awards. How do you reconcile, like, I'm following my dream, I'm doing this is awesome, but I used to do this in a soccer field?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's something that over the past couple months I've had a lot of time to reflect on. So, I've transitioned out of running the day-to-day of the business, and there's a lot that we can obviously dive into about it. But, when I first was getting out of college, actually in college, there was a kid on the team. His name is Rich. He's a good friend. He lives in Chicago, and he and I both had a passion to try to be entrepreneurial in some capacity. And we started reading the whole Rich Dad Poor Dad series. And it kind of got us kickstarted to learn about what's the difference between, an S Corp, C Corp, LLC. It gives you all these things about, how you make money and how the rich make money. And it was probably more towards like the real estate side. But he and I always had a passion for trying to start something. So as soon as I got done with school, I always wanted to work. I didn't want to go and, tour Europe for a couple months and take some time off. I've always been, kind of a grinder and wanting to kind of start making money. It had always intrigued me. And so I was doing
both, brother.
I was doing IT recruiting for a company. And how I got into that was just my brother was in the HR and he had agreed, said, you should get into this. So I was like, all right, I guess I'm going to go in and do some IT recruiting. I'm sitting behind this desk and making all these phone calls. I'm like, this sucks. I just cannot stand. I like to move, and energy is something that's important for me. So I ended up calling a buddy who I played soccer with. And he was a goalie at Western as well. And so I call him up and I'm like, hey, listen, your dad you guys live in a huge house. He drives this Escalade and he's got all this money and it's fantastic. What does he do? So I set up a lunch with him. He's like, I'm in this business called the data centers. And he's like, this is the future. And I'm thinking to myself, I have no idea what a data center is. And so what I started doing was I was starting to make some sales calls out to the West Coast. So I was working a full-time job doing this IT recruiting. And then I started making some sales calls out to the West Coast about data centers. We had a very specific product that we were trying to push out to the market. And so from there, that's when kind of the journey began. So that was in 2006. And so I'd worked for that company for a little bit. I left and I was with another small startup with me and another gentleman. And that ended up kind of going down a different path. And then, I was sitting there and I've always had this passion for wanting to work and help and try to create change. And I'm watching a commercial. I'm in a bar, and this is in 2012, and George Clooney comes on. I'm watching soccer actually, because you used to not be able to get FS1 anywhere, and that's where they used to show all like the EPL games and all that. And so I'm sitting there at this bar. And I'm having a cocktail. I'm the only person in there, and this commercial comes on. It's George Clooney. It's like gotyoursix.org. And it was about how we're going to bring all these military vets back, into the work world. And there was these initiatives that were put together. And I started thinking, I'm like, man, there's something there, because our industry has some veterans, but it was very specific, like niche as to, who they would try to recruit for. And so all of a sudden I was like, man, there's something here. So I started to think, and I started writing down notes literally on a bar napkin. And I was thinking, and I kept going back there, because that's where I was like spur thought. It was like where it was. And I finally just pick up the phone and I call up this gentleman. His name's Lee, and retired colonel. I said, "Man, I got this idea. What do you think?" And like 30 seconds into this business pitch, he's like, "I'm in." So next thing you know, 2 weeks later, he's on a plane from Seattle flying into Chicago, is where I was living at the time. And I showed him this business model, and he's like, "Let's roll." And then from there, we've kind of been off to the races. So it started off very much of, working with vets, transitioning them into the civilian sector in very early days. Like the recruiting that we were doing was like the unemployment rate was very disproportionate to the regular kind of civilian unemployment rate. So we're coming out of 2008, 8% unemployment. And with veterans that we're going after, it was like 25% unemployment. And so we basically wrote down this business model that said, hey, we're going to hire veterans, we're going to train them up, we're going to create this ecosystem to get them jobs in the tech space. Now, at that time, we had no idea there was going to be this massive tech boom from like cloud infrastructure. Now you're seeing this AI, ML stuff that's coming out there. And so our first year, we ended up with like 5 employees in our first year of business, and we kept learning and making a little bit of progress. And so, right now we're over 11 years old, and we've got about 1,600 employees. We're in 16 countries, and we continue to make this impact on the social side of helping veterans, their ecosystem, military spouse programs, all these things that Lee and I have a passion for, to be able to kind of continue to make incremental improvement for people. And that was really kind of the passion of what I've always been, what I've always loved doing, and what's always kind of given me the joy every single day is really, helping people. And those that kind of know me closest, I'm, generous beyond belief, and like seeing people smile, and, doing these blind gifts to people and watching someone get excited for something, and helping out. That's really the passion, right? And that's where it's like great with teammates, right? And soccer was my sport as well. And obviously, working with your team and going through all the different adversity that a team can go through and having success come out the other end it's awesome.
Man. Well, as everybody knows in the show, I'm a huge note taker, so I am like
Yeah,
scribbling
yeah,
away madly. We're a huge fan of dropping sort of value nuggets here.
yeah,
A couple that I don't want our younger entrepreneurs, and younger just means on your journey, not
yeah,
necessarily by age, is that you mentioned Rich Dad Poor Dad. My guess is that wasn't the last book that you read, but that stirred
no,
some thinking. I could probably take up a whole show talking about the books. Same, just reading, thirsty for that, trying to figure out what's next in that whole learning curve. And the other is you set up a lunch. And, I think you or I might skip over that. It's like, yeah, of course, I set up a lunch. But again, if you're early in your journey, the one thing you recognized is here's somebody that is doing it that I can already see, including having a lifestyle that looks pretty damn cool.
yep,
And I'm going to set up a lunch and just say, how did you do that? Now, what most people like, you want the thing, but do you want the work it takes to get the thing? That's why you set up the lunch.
yeah,
So I think, in the entirety of the story, I love those two little things, because I think if nothing more, if you're thinking about being on this journey and you're like, I don't know where to start with somebody that you'd look at and go, I think they're on that journey. And I just love to find out how they've been doing it. It's a great
yeah.
start, right? So I'm
Yeah,
glad to hear you say
absolutely.
that.
I think one of the most important things is really about the curiosity, right? Of like, for very young, I wanted to make money. I mean, that was something that I was very passionate about, and that started from the books. And then from there, it's what does it take in order to do that, right? And I think there's a level of curiosity that needs to exist with starting to ask questions, put yourself out there, be willing to ask someone to take you to lunch, even though they may say, why would I even help this kid? There's, what's the
Yep.
value in it for me to be able to do that, right? And so you're going to find people out there there are people out there that are willing to certainly help and actually have a conversation with you. I mean, that's the most important thing, is to be able to be curious, have that conversation, and have the courage to go and ask. And that's where I think sports is, like, athletes, there's this, you have to be willing to get out there, right? The ones that continue to excel, and putting yourselves out there it's important.
Do you think, so again, this episode feels like I'm just asking questions that I
Yeah,
feel like I want to ask. No disrespect to our
yeah,
tribe here, but do you think that, like, okay, the money, like, I knew I wanted to go make money. What I found with some entrepreneurs who also are athletes is when we're younger, the scoreboard was that thing. Because obviously we're doing our sports, we're teenagers, we're then going to college, and money is a relative thing. It's like, can I afford enough to have
Yeah.
ramen or whatever it is? We didn't have NIL deals back then.
No,
Um,
no, certainly not.
and I felt like the scoreboard was the thing. Like winning and keeping score was the money, was the currency. And my curiosity came from if I sucked it up, especially as a goalkeeper, watching game film, talking to my coaches, being willing to take feedback from maybe teammates, which, man, that would be painful sometimes. But I think in that was that curiosity. Do you see the same thing, like as you transitioned from sport, obviously playing Division I soccer, into even when you're working for somebody else? Was that curiosity still there? Did it transition that way?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that in anything, it's like relating to sports very line, like Western. A stat is my freshman year, I think we won 6 games. My sophomore year, we won 3 games. And then my junior year, we got most improved team in the country. We ended up winning the MAC and then going to the NCAA tournament, the first time that the school's done that in forever. And now, Chad's got the program going off to the races these days, which is fantastic. And it was being willing to put in the work and wanting to win and being that kind of that competitive nature. And it does start with kind of watching film, even though film watching really wasn't a thing when I was playing in 2001. Now it's at the ready. My 9-year-old plays and they got those cameras up and you can go back to film everything and see different ways to improve. And I think that's why a lot of kids are better. Obviously, the amount of training helps as well. But to see what you've been able to do is something that's important. But yeah, as you get into the work world, the curiosity to me is kind of that leadership component that is something that's absolutely needed. And you said to me about the critical feedback, it's like sometimes you don't want to hear it, but you need to hear it, and it allows you to take that next step. And so when I ended up starting SLU with Lee, he had been, he was in the military for, 30 years and retired colonel. So he was used to being able to give critical feedback and was very, straight to the point. And I remember these Saturday calls that we'd have in the morning. I'd have coffee and he lived down in Seattle. So we had a couple hour difference. And he was like, hey, you got to work on these things. Unless you do this, you're not going to be able to kind of take this next step. And at the time, I'm like, fuck, I don't want to hear that. That's awful to hear. And then you're able to kind of take it, process it, and, learn and get better from it. And that's how you're ultimately able to get the improvement. So you talked about like the feedback. I think that's something that is unbelievably important that you could take from the sports world right into into the business community and whatever your passion is. And unless you're getting the feedback, there's no way to improve. And I also think part of that as well is something that doesn't get talked about as much as just evolving, right? When we first started the business, it was very much one way and one thing. Unless you're getting that critical feedback, and if you're too stubborn, you're going to fall behind. Like you have to be able to continue to evolve. Otherwise, you'll be left behind, and that goes for whether it's sports or in the business world. Every company is constantly trying to take that info to be able to get ahead of what's coming.
So for our guys who are already on that journey, I think that's a good segue here is you talk about feedback. My guess is you talked about it with Lee as just,
Mm-hmm.
solid stand-up dude, military
Oh yeah.
background, probably brings a lot of discipline and process and knows how to give that feedback. Then you've got employees and peer groups, right, within your organization. I would imagine following that same lead. It's
Mm-hmm.
part of the culture. And then feedback from customers. And I think that's the tricky part, right? So I'd love to hear your take on is the customer always right when it comes to feedback, right? It's not a loaded question because I think
No.
there's answers on both sides, but
No, I think it's just a balance, right? Just as in anything. Yes, sometimes they're right and sometimes they just can't see it. And so I'm always I tend to self-reflect and look and put all the blame always on myself and how, a customer says something, how could I have done a little bit different in order to get, potential outcome that they may be looking for. But at the end, you also have to understand that just because they give it doesn't mean it makes sense for the business. They may not just be the right customer for you. And that's very difficult in the early days of a business because you're scrapping for business and revenue and finding different ways to make it. You got to be disciplined. I think you said the word about Lee. I mean, he brought a level of just discipline to myself, and he's probably one of the best mentors I've ever had of having that discipline of being able to know the work ethic it takes, know the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and staying the course in order to achieve those outcomes. And sometimes you're going to get those detractors that will say, hey, go down this one rabbit hole. And, it's not always the path that you want to go down. And it takes you too far off of course. And so having some of that leeway in anything you do, I think is important. But, making sure that there was this concept that we always had with like start with the end in mind, right? Of like, here's where
Mhm.
we're ultimately the end game of where we're trying to get to. And, here's where we're at today. And here's how we're going to try to get there. And you're going to get customers to suck you down in a path that may not work. And so you got to be really disciplined to know like, hey, sorry, customer, it's just not going to work. Maybe go to this other provider because it's not going to really fit for where we want to ultimately take the business. But you also have to understand that you could have a path that you want to go down and it just may not work, or the market may not be mature enough for that idea at that given time. And so there's a little bit of a delicate balance that you're going to have to pay attention to.
So you mentioned the North Star, and sort of starting with the end in mind. I think those things
Mm-hmm.
are kind of synonymous, right? If you don't know where
Yeah.
you're going, you'll always end up in the wrong spot.
Yeah.
Man, I could go in so many different directions
Yeah.
here
Yeah.
that are all related. I got to ask this first because I feel like it's just
Yeah.
hanging. How did you know that working with the vets, working with our military personnel, kind of getting them back into the workforce? What was it that said this is part of my business plan? This is part of what I want to do.
It's just a passion. It was a need that was desperate in the market at the time that, I was in 2001 is when for 9/11 it happened. I was sitting in the dorm room as a freshman in college, and to see that happen and then to have people who had deployed that I knew and just to see what they went through when they came back, and then having met Lee in the industry and seeing all the work that he had done, it's there was a passion that was developed for our country and the freedoms that we have and wanting to be able to help those that help give us what we have today. So it's really just a passion that was ultimately developed of wanting to be able to help people that may not know about a particular industry, and there was a need too. So there was a need both on returning veterans and getting them employed, but then in our industry there was also a need of getting people who were willing to serve a certain purpose. So that was whether turning a wrench or any sort of blue collar type of jobs, and they just married extremely well together. And so we were solving two problems that existed, and that's where the business all sprung from, and allowed us to kind of start the journey that we're on, and we're still on.
Um, at the risk of, it just feels like such a huge win, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's patriotic. It's so good for the human side of our businesses. Huge and worthy cause. What I don't want is someone to walk away and go, "Man, that sounds like the easy button," because I'm sure it isn't. Maybe
No.
give us a. Is there a downside, or were there challenges? Even maybe just one major one. We'd say, yeah. I mean, you've got this workforce coming in, their unemployment rate certainly higher than the national average.
Yeah.
My guess is you didn't just snap your fingers and plug somebody in and it worked. So what were the challenges to fulfill that mission and that culture for you guys to make sure you stayed on point? What were the extra steps you had to take?
Yeah, it was really just on the recruiting side and the HR front of
Hmm.
making sure that you stayed disciplined on who you hire. Just because um, you were a veteran did not mean it was the right fit for the company of what we were ultimately looking for. And having that discipline, but also having the passion to make sure that you would still get the right people in the business that were a good cultural fit and really signed up for the same mission of ultimately what we were trying to accomplish. So that was the hardest part. I mean, you could make calls, and a beautiful thing today is it's very difficult to hire veterans these days because the unemployment rate is below the national average. There's a lot of
Hmm.
fantastic programs that exist. The Department of Defense has put out these fantastic programs that allows people to transition a lot easier. When we were first starting the business, it was you go on the unemployment website and there was just like a little American flag that would show you that this person was a veteran. Now there's just tremendous amount of programs that exist that makes it a lot easier to identify, and it makes the transition back into the civilian sector a lot easier. So for us, it was really, getting access to people, but then also making sure that we stayed disciplined and making sure that we hired the right people that would be able to allow the business to to thrive, execute on the projects that we needed to execute on, and get to where we were going.
So I feel like this is a little bit of a tell. If I ask
Yep.
you, not I won't put you on the spot with all the sort of company values and the mission,
Hmm.
but can you think of a couple of the words that you guys use when you talk about the values of your company? I have a sneaking suspicion I've written some of them down already, but
Yeah. So it's funny. So
fire a few away.
we came up with this like spirit ethos, right? It's speed, purpose, innovation, reliability, inclusiveness, and trust. Being able, those are like the kind of the core tenets, ethos of who we are as a business. Speed, you got to be able to respond. Purpose of what we're trying to accomplish. Inclusiveness, everybody is welcome into our business. I mean, when you're in 16 different countries, not everybody is a veteran within the business, and the way people look at things in Europe for veterans is way different than the patriotism that may exist within North America. Is just too different. So kind of balancing that and being a global company is tough. So we've rallied around the spirit ethos is what we talk about every single day, and how we like to operate both internally and externally to our customers. So those are the big values for us as a business. And each of those, within any sort of company, right? You create your culture slides, and there's a whole information sheet, internal, external, about each of these words and why they're important to us and to our customers.
So to me, the takeaway, and I'm saying this is sort of a aha or no shit, this is totally obvious to our
Mm-hmm.
listeners, which is I think we're into the first few minutes of the show, and everybody that's listening would get this. That's I think
Mm-hmm.
my thing that was written down, that you're the same guy. We don't really know each other that well, but I already know
No.
in two meetings you're the same guy on Tuesday that you are on Friday as you are on Saturday. Your passions are firm. Your commitment, and you use the word discipline probably 30 different times, which I feel like really fell into what you were trying to create. And at the end of the day, you were living those values. So for anybody who's listening and you're wondering, man, I'm on this journey, but I feel like it's a little haphazard from the people that we hire to what's going on in my real or virtual office, however you do business.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you can state this loud enough. Work on culture. And culture
Oh
could
yeah.
be two people. I'm sure when you and Lee flew out to see you, my guess is he was talking about what is this going to look like and what's that foundation.
Yep.
So it doesn't have to be when you finally grow to 1,600 people and you go, oh man, it's probably too late to create culture. I
It's
love the
difficult
fact
to
that
change it. Yeah.
it, it it doesn't feel like you were this amoeba just kind of floating around. It's like, no, we had a pretty clear direction. We saw this gap in the workforce. We wanted to create an
Mm-hmm.
opportunity. Is it flipped the other way today? Yeah, and I'd say probably in part because of what you guys were doing, right? You were creating an environment that said, hey, there's success over here. If anybody wants to come see how we do it, my guess is you didn't stuff it in a safe somewhere.
No.
You're plenty willing to
I,
talk about it.
I'll tell you, we created a
um,
movement, I like to
yeah.
say, in our industry, right? When we first started, there was nobody that really had veteran programs. And now every company, from the big, we'll call them hyperscalers, so the big FANG stocks out there, to all the different operators exist. Everybody now has a program. And we really felt like we created a true movement in the value that they can bring. And so we feel like we've certainly have helped and have done very good. And we've also help change lives, right? It's been very purposeful, and it's meant a lot to me personally about what we've been able to do. I mean, I probably can't even correlate to how many people like we've been able to help, and like the trickle down effect and second, third order effects of being able to hire somebody, and what that had an impact on them, that they then, maybe they're not still with us, but they went to some other industry and then they created change, right? I mean, and to be able to do that globally, and as much as we've had, has been, it's been great. I really love it.
Uh, well, yeah, and thank you for sharing that, because that to me is the start of and clear indication of legacy, right? Because we talk about building legacy, I think oftentimes it gets muddled into something that's either brick and mortar or how many zeros are in your bank account, and not that at the end of the day those aren't maybe part of it, but what you're talking about is true life changing for each of those individuals, military or not, right? As they came
Mm-hmm.
through your organization, they understood that discipline. Even if they weren't in the military, most likely got a chance to work with somebody who was, garnered something from that. Wherever they went
Yep.
on, they took that with them. And
Yep.
yeah, I think that is, as entrepreneurs, if anybody's hanging on, man, why am I doing this? It goes back to my first question. It wasn't about, hey, go become a soccer coach because you love soccer. You clearly love playing in a team, high
Mm-hmm.
performing in a team. using that environment, which included feedback and discipline and creating this culture. And 1,600 plus people later, uh, wow, right? Like, holy
Yeah.
crap, that's pretty amazing. Share what you will on this. Speaking of creating an amazing company, okay,
Hmm.
you've had a chance to have an exit now, and
Hmm.
so we don't have to share the gory details about what that looks
Hmm.
like. But
Oh
at
yeah.
some point in time in that business journey, started back in 2013ish, let's
Yep.
say. Can you remember the time that it was like, man, we may be wanting to think about taking on a partner, thinking about an exit, some portion of that? Because I think a lot of our listeners, if they've been doing it for a while, are like, we're having some success. That kind of
Yeah.
sounds like my story here, and but we're not thinking about it. Should we be? And
Yeah.
so I'm curious how that kind of
It's
popped on your radar.
it was a forcing function of the business. And Lee and I talk about it. We remember it very vividly. It was so we started the birthday January 23rd of 2013 as the day we incorporated, and it's a great day. But we uh, in 2020, right before kind of COVID was starting, we had a very difficult time getting money from the banks. Lee and I, not one percenters, and there was only so much collateral he had. They would only accept so much AR as far as for-year collateral to take on the debt facility. And you're laughing, right?
I'm laughing because I know your
Yeah,
pain.
yeah. So it's tough. So we reached out to actually our best customer, and we said, "Hey, listen, you all have private equity. A lot of people who are willing to put money into companies. Would you be willing to make some introductions?" And so Lee and I got on a plane to New York, and we met up with around 10 or 15 different private equity companies. But we ultimately ended up going and the reason for it is because we didn't have enough cash to keep the business going. And it wasn't because we weren't cash flow positive. It was just really we were growing at an exponential rate. And unfortunately, the banks, as much as they were saying they were going to be willing to give you some money, they weren't. And so we started
And the,
that
and the
process of
goalkeeper's definition there, it's called organic growth.
yeah,
Every dollar you
correct,
make,
yes.
you pour back into the business. And so you're a business rich and cash poor, even though you're cash
Yeah,
flow positive.
exactly.
Exactly that. When growth is outpacing the ability to turn another dollar into more growth,
I mean, we
you
were
end up on this
growing
journey. So
80, 90%. And it was just, we just really, what we were baffled by is like, why wouldn't the banks give us money? Right. I mean, this was, early right after 2008. So it was very difficult. Now, what I do find funny, as soon as we brought on a PR partner, and it's on the website, LLR Partners, they're fantastic. They're out of Philly, and they were more of that entry level type of EBITDA businesses that were in that 3 to 7 million EBITDA range is the type of deals that they would like to go after. And one of the main reasons we went with them is because 50% of the businesses that they would invest in were founder led businesses. So they
mm,
understood we what we would be going through, and they would have an entire ecosystem to be able to support you on your journey, from whether it's like building out IT systems or bringing on a proper CFO and putting all the tools in place and tax strategies in order to be able to continue to operate the business as you know as global as we were. But going back to the banks, it was funny. As soon as that happened, the banks would then reach out and they'd be like, how much money do you want? How much money do you want at that point? Just because you're now backed by an established private equity company and being able to get the capital you needed to make the investments in order to grow. It's quite the journey. You always hear, from when we were starting the process, a lot of people may be going through it. Is like you hear the horror stories of private equity deals that have gone bad, but there's a lot of private equity deals that go well for the business to be able to allow it to continue to thrive. And there's always sacrifices that end up coming from when you end up doing a private equity deal. But I would say for the most part, if you find the right partner and you have the right relationships, they tend to work out. And with LLR, it's went extremely well. We've actually just recently went through another recap because we kind of outgrew and outpaced to what we need for the next wave of growth for this industry. And it's we just recently just partnered up with New Mount Capital to be able to continue to make the next wave of investments, and all the original shareholders are still on the cap table and original private equity partners. And we have this aspirations to be $1 billion business and over the next few years, and we've hired some fantastic leaders in order to to get us there. So in the short period of time, most of the holds with these private equity groups, 5-7 years, and we were just about 3 years, and we had grown, probably we had acquired two different companies, and we had grown, I don't know, probably 300-400%. And so it was that time to bring on that next tier of private equity groups that takes you from to the $1 billion valuations that exist. And so I've learned a ton on the private equity side, and it's been a fun journey.
So you mentioned some sacrifices, and hopefully this doesn't throw the group under the bus. But
Mm-hmm.
I think with any, right, when you take the money, you're inviting another boss onto the table, or
Correct.
onto the set, and at the table. What are a couple that, if anybody's not been on that journey yet, that you'd say, yeah, I mean, kind of expect these, and these are what they were for us?
Yeah, so it was our capital partner was fantastic. It wasn't We didn't really take any sort of money off. It was just about infusing capital into the business. So it wasn't like these chips and we're getting all this money and rich and we're buying Ferraris or anything like that. It was really to truly help fund the business to be able to get it to where it needs to where to go. So it was different. It was like creating a board, right? We didn't really
Mm.
have a board. It was just Lee and I would make phone calls to each other and we say, hey, we want to do this. Sure, that's great. So now you have the reporting of the board dynamics
Raise your
and
hand. Yeah, I'm in. I'm
yeah,
in.
yeah, exactly. So, yeah, the board dynamics and reporting out. I think that was the biggest thing that caught me off guard. That in all my conversations I had with everybody was the amount of data that they would be looking for and how consuming that can be for you very early on, from just the dynamics of the board packages to all the reporting. I mean, when we did our first deal, we were still using QuickBooks, which is many out there.
Yeah.
That's like your base of your base ERP. And we've moved on to Sage and all the other stuff that you end up doing is, but you having that first, you just don't have all the data, and it
Yeah.
requires a lot of just manual manipulation in order to get the outputs that ultimately looking for, so they can report out to their LPs, and there's this whole journey that goes on. So I'd say that was the hardest thing. The partner that we got along absolutely fantastic. He was a great guy, and we'd almost talk, I don't know, every couple days. We'd have our standing calls, and they were very much of a partner mindset and gave us the latitude to do what we needed to do in order to continue to grow. Now, I will tell you, it certainly helps that we were growing at the rate that we were growing, because there's always less pressure whenever revenue exceeds the expectation. And so we were very fortunate in that regard. But I would say, to answer your question, that data was something that really consumed the business. So it was something that I would say probably it caught me off guard. And I would certainly pass that on, advice on to others. Of all the people I talked to, not one person made that comment to me.
No, that's great. And there should be there'll be a ticker tape disclaimer going that when revenue exceeds expectations,
Yeah.
beware of smooth road ahead.
Yeah, yeah,
'Cause it
exactly.
doesn't always
Exactly.
happen that way, right?
No, it certainly does not.
Um,
We certainly have had our
you know,
hiccups, that's for sure.
I think a great takeaway there too, because you got to learn it, thankfully, in a nice environment and comfortable environment, and inviting. It was their demand, if you will. Hey, get this board put in place. One thing that I think a lot of companies can do, and I didn't, through Protexo, which was our big win. My
Yep.
old business partner Rob Emery, who's still a great friend, we built and sold that company, acquired by a publicly traded company, and at that point we joined their board, and it was like, holy shit, wow, this is damn. Now I'm back in startup mode. We've got a golf clothing company, Galway Bay, plenty of other fun things to play with. And I have found that putting an advisory board in early creates that feedback loop. They do
Yep.
demand data, maybe not to the extent certainly that your guys did, but you start to
Hmm.
build a muscle, right? Going back to us being athletes, you're not coming from a summer off to two a days. Like you start building the muscle. And I think getting a board of advisors, especially if they're not all the same people, not your buddies, people that are contrarian thinking, challenge you a little bit, speaking of feedback,
Hmm.
and have that data. I'll give props to our guy, Robert Wolf, the old co-founder of Moose Jaw Mountaineering.
Yep.
They've now come up with a product called Zec, and they're automating the board reports for that exact reason. That don't hide from it, put it front and center.
Yep.
So I think
Yep.
forming a board, whether it's in simplest form, board of advisors, you don't have any
Hmm.
rules that have to come around that other than you're surrounding yourself and get good data, right? I mean, just
Yeah,
you're going to need it
I'm
in the
with you
end.
on
So
that.
that's great advice.
Yeah, for sure. The fidelity of the data is something that's so important that I wish we were better at in the very early days. But for myself, it was unique. So I'm 41 years old. So I was 37 years old when this was coming on. I was 29 when we started this thing, and so I was always the more younger person into the room, and our board were the more senior folks who had been there, done that, which is fantastic. And being a sponge was something that I took pride in, of learning from other people's mistakes, so I didn't make those type of mistakes. And that's where I was frustrated about not being caught off guard with the amount of information that was going to be needed, because it is very time consuming. And I did listen to the Moose Jaw one, which was great. And but yeah, having that advisor group or mentorship or someone to be able to bounce ideas off of is super important. And personally, I think I had a little bit of the luxury of being on the younger side and having older mentors that kind of looked at me as like I was their kids and their son, and wanting to help learn and pass that on to other people. And I was welcoming of that feedback. And I
Man.
certainly got very, very comfortable of getting this information, processing it, and then figuring out kind of what to be able to do of what I thought would be the best you know decision.
All right. Well, I'm taking the lid off of this one. So
Yeah.
you're, let's say, I'll just call you the youngest at the table. And I think for
Yep.
most of us, earning a seat at the table feels like a challenge sometimes, especially if we don't arrive with insert Ivy School MBA here. Not that that's a
Hmm.
bad thing, but I think especially for athletes who may have transitioned from, if they're fortunate, playing a pro sport for X number of years, regardless of what their bank account says, there's a gap in your resume and you end up at this table. And I think for most, there's this imposter syndrome of, man, I'm not old enough. I'm not good enough. I don't know enough. All the things we tell ourselves. And I am, trust me, like I am the poster child for that, right? I can
Yeah,
tell you
I'm
the
guilty
not great
myself.
university I went to, or what I didn't learn in school, or all those things that I would tell myself. So you're the youngest guy there. Did that ever creep in? Like, I'm not good enough. I'm not here, but I kind of heard you say, no, I've kind of embraced it. So what was the balance there for you?
So I embraced the information, and it certainly was, I'll call it a little bit overwhelming, and realizing how little I actually knew at that time and how much you're able to absorb was something that was, it was absolutely needed. If I wasn't going to be able to absorb it, accept it, and then be able to use it, I don't think we would have been able to make it work. And so, yes, it still creeps in the head as far as being, the younger person. I'm 41. I feel like I got a lot of life to live, and I've learned a lot at for my age and where I'm at, and ultimately where, you know, what I want to try to do into the future. But yes, it's still there. It's definitely still there. I've always had this, and it's just kind of the way I was raised, and maybe it was just a generational thing of, you always listen to whoever's older than you. It's more of just like the respect factor, on how my parents raised me. We were, downriver family, and for those that know, it's just outside of Detroit, in Michigan, and that's just how we were raised. Very just humble, and you respect. You certainly respect people, and so that was something that I still struggle with today, and that I have to work. I'm not a big fan of giving advice to people who are older than me. I certainly don't have a problem getting it to people that are younger, but we've certainly learned a ton. And it's funny because Lee, he would always tell me, he's like, you got to get over that. You know so much. I got to be able to pass this out. So he would always be kind of my sounding board of like, you got to move past that. And it's difficult to do though,
Well,
just because that's how you were
yeah,
raised your whole life.
I bring it up that way for exactly that. Like you had that upbringing. I think I grew up in pretty humble, lower middle class.
Yep.
Respect your elders. Work hard. Uh, God gave you two ears and one mouth. Like make sure the two are
Yeah.
working. Right. Those kind
Yep.
of things. So I guess as we transition, because you're talking about the future here, you had a culminating event that's still sort of ongoing as the company obviously isn't gone.
Yep.
It's growing bigger than ever. You had the day where you got to check your bank account. We won't talk about
Hmm.
what was in there
Hmm.
before that time you checked and after. What was the emotion like post transaction where you're like, man, my life just changed today financially? What was it for you, your wife? Like, was it any different? Like, what was it like?
No, we still drive the same car and do the same things, and we donate a ton of money more than we spend. It's really just there, and it's nice that, able to pay for the kids' college, but don't think it's changed me whatsoever. I look for more ways to give back and to do more and have a bigger impact than what we currently had with what we were doing with Salute. So that's just kind of how I am. So it's, if you're able to continue, if you don't focus, I learned, like, if you're not focusing on the money, obviously the money's nice and it comes, but it's what you're able to do and how you're able to get back, and the impact that we've had with the business is something that, I'm truly proud of. So to me, it wasn't really anything different. It's funny. Everyone's like, "Oh, are you doing a trip? You doing this and this and that? Are you buying a car?" I'm like, "No, we're doing nothing. We're trying to help out more people." I mean, that's ultimately what, comes to, what's always come to my mind. And it's been nice. Obviously, it's great to have the security blanket, and that's always, fulfilling to look back and to say, "Oh man, we created something," and that's great. But it really has not changed us. I still drive the same cars we had post all this, and it's live in the same house and have the same friends. And but what we do look at is that we're able to do more, right? And you're, being more generous than what you have been before, and, trying to find other areas to make impact on people. So, now that I'm out of, phasing out of Salute and good to go do my next journey in life, it's, continuously trying to find what that impact's going to be, because that's what gives me satisfaction. Is like when I go to bed knowing, like, fuck, I help so many different people all over this globe, and everybody, it's funny, we had this moment. So we brought on a CEO, and, almost a year and a half ago, and we had this big kickoff meeting last year. And there was this moment where we have all of our leaders from all the different countries coming in. There's like 100 people that we flew in, and we're sitting there, and then we get announced. Leonard's like, "Oh, the founders of Salute." And I'm like, it kind of like hit me. I'm sitting on the stage, or standing on the stage, excuse me. And we got all this stuff, this loud music going, DJs and all these things. And it kind of had like this flashback moment to when it was just the two of us sitting there at O'Hare Airport, sitting at that Hilton. I think it was Hilton at the time. And we're just talking about this very simple idea and how it can have this, and how it had this huge impact. And so it kind of was like this overwhelming moment. I didn't get, a super emotion on there, but I was able to really spend a lot of time and see everybody out there and see how excited everyone is to be kind of part of this. And it's a different experience, I think, from a founder standpoint than it may be, coming up and working through the ranks and, to become an executive through a different path. I think, I spend most of my time now kind of being that, culture carrier and that founder and rah-rah and all the exciting stuff that, the business is doing. And I've gained this huge appreciation for the things that we've done. And sometimes it takes time. And that's a little bit of being, super humble about everything that we've been able to accomplish. But that's what's gratifying to me, is now we're going to be able to do, more things. And I'm not sitting here acting like I'm Jesus, but, we're trying to find the next thing to have the bigger impact than what we currently had, and what we're able to do with Salute.
Yeah, and I know when we talked the first time we met, your humble approach certainly pervades all this conversation, which is you were thinking about this before you decided to go find a firm to help you guys out. You were thinking about this before the bank account changed at the end of the day. And I think the huge takeaway that's been pretty common, quite frankly, we've had some just a really awesome range of people on the show, is it wasn't like I was super frugal, I didn't do anything, and then suddenly I had a fat bank account, and then I started to think about these things. And so my encouragement to our kind of core people is that if you're thinking about it now, do it now. Because again, it goes back to us as athletes, exercise the muscle, man. I mean, you've done it everywhere you've been before. Don't change that. Mm-hmm. If it means you're giving $10 instead of in the future 10,000, or hopefully you're lucky enough to do 10 million, it won't change if you start now. In the future, it may change for the better, as it has for you, which has been awesome. I think that's a really good common theme. And I'm glad to hear that, you're in that group of, we're just thinking about ways to do things better. And I know maybe a little bit more than the general public of you're finding ways to do that Secret Santa style, which is, I think, just the best, right? Because it isn't about see my name on that plaque, or here's my name over the family name over the library. There are going to be a lot of kids impacted through your generosity that nobody other than you and your wife and, maybe your kids someday will know. And I just
Hmm.
think that's huge. So as you think about that and kind of in the spirit of the show, to the extent you can share, like what's
Yeah.
next for you, right? You're coming up on some timelines to hit, and then my guess is you're not going to jump on a boat and play golf 8 days a week. Although you and I have talked about you've had a
Yeah, we
chance to
need to
play at
find
some
some
pretty
golf. Yeah.
awesome places.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah, for sure. I've
what,
been very fortunate.
what's next for Jason on this journey?
I certainly want to start another business. That's
Hmm.
that's in the cards. But what I want to do is, work my way through this transition period with Salute, and then, next year maybe take a couple weeks off, or I should say probably months, but it most likely will be weeks. And I already have a couple new business ideas that I've already started to plot out, and starting to put plans together, and really just start to go execute on those things. What I've been torn about is, do you want to go back to the 90-hour work weeks? And I know when we first chatted about that, this is a real thing. Actually, you can work that many hours, particularly with the
It
cell
actually
phones.
is.
It's all day, every day, and no vacations, and there's no work life balance. It's just work always.
Yeah, simple math, folks.
It's
7 days
Yeah.
a week, 12 hours a day is 84. You still got to put in another six somewhere.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, there's always something, and even when you're international, it's like on planes constantly. You never know what time zone you're in anymore, and you just kind of become numb to it. And that's what waking up early, and you just get you and staying up late and still being able to focus. A quick thing on that is, when we were first doing our first recap, I remember it was like midnight, and we're on the phone with the attorneys, and we're going through these legal documents, like 80 pages of 10 font, going over debt covenant. I'm like, it's just, it really tests your limits on what you're able to actually process and handle. And it's that was certainly a lot of hours. So I've been debating whether to help just invest into it, and to work with somebody else who may want to, put in those hours and allow them to be able to, go through a similar journey that I've been able to go through, or if I want to do it. So I kind of been torn. I'm more leaning towards kind of helping invest into it, and bringing on some young leaders to help mentor them and get them kind of set up for success into the future is kind of the path I'm more leaning towards. And then also just kind of working on continuing to give back. I mean, you kind of mentioned just some of the stuff that we're doing. I've been very fortunate. I love soccer, and I want to be able to continue to give back. I mean, my kid's he's 9, he plays, and I love watching. And I'm one of those rowdy parents, and I probably say too much or try to get involved in the games too much, but I certainly enjoy it. And my nephews all play soccer. One's going over to Western Michigan, where I played, which is awesome to see that happen. So I'm sure I'll be making more and more trips to Kalamazoo and spending some time over there. And it's kind of reinvigorated me back into the sport that I absolutely loved and learned so much from, and kind of it got me where I am today. And so to be able to kind of, what's next is, helping out, right? Trying to mentor the next generation, handing them, Rich Dad Poor Dad books, and saying, hey, you should read this, whether you want to read this or not. You're going to learn something out of this book,
Yep.
and there's so much that you can take, and maybe it sparks that next idea, whether that idea came from you or not. But at least, providing that opportunity is something that I really want to do, and that's where I'll spend most of my time.
That's awesome. And I'll give you some collective unsolicited advice, which is
Yep.
a little bit for me, but I think I've also heard this consistently on the show. In the spirit of we've got a superpower and kryptonite, our strength can be our weakness.
Yep.
I too am an operator. I'm a startup guy, and I did know that post our transaction at ProtectCell, took some time off and had that same inkling, like I'm going to go back and do this again. Now that I know all these things, the shortcut should be obvious. And they're probably some of the biggest stumblings because I was so wrapped up on wanting to do it better than I did the first time
Oh
that I
yeah.
finally found my lane with Opportunity Seed. You and I talked a little bit about this, of
Yep.
getting behind some of those entrepreneurs, leaning in. I'm not afraid to roll up my sleeves. Hard work, I think, screams my name, fortunately or unfortunately. But yeah, it has created more time to do what you're talking about. So, it's worth a cup of coffee maybe, but I think, yeah, your superpower of being able to lean in, process, guide others, we've clearly heard it on this show. Just hope you get more time to do that because the impact is huge. I think we're going to learn more about how huge that is in some ways, and others, no one will ever know about it. It's still going to be
Yeah.
huge. So, Jason, thank you for
Absolutely.
being on the show. Folks, if you like what you saw, please subscribe. send us notes. We love this, right? That's how we get
Uh,
guys like Jason on the show. Half the questions come around things like this. So keep the feedback coming. It's great. Again, hit the like and subscribe button, and we'll see you on the next episode of What's Next.